Thank you for having me, Courtney and Charlie. Let me just start my clock. I'm starting it now, by the way, a bit late. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about nutrition and athlete immune health today with a food first but not food only approach. A quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll present a very quick case that infection's a real problem for elite athletes and that various lifestyle factors lower athlete immunity, making it very difficult to research actually. How nutrition influences immunity, I'll provide you with a rationale for that. I'll talk a little bit about the red hot topic, red S, and low energy availability and athlete immunity. I'll present a new paradigm on resistance and tolerance, and a little bit about one of our recent papers on food first. And then I'll leave you with some nutritional recommendations to maintain immunity. Okay. So this is a sort of synopsis of about 30 years worth of research now on why infection is incompatible with success in elite sport. We know that world-leading world record holders seem to suffer fewer infections and shorter infections than even national level athletes. And we don't quite know why that is. It might be because of, better hygiene practices and so on, or there may be some genetic trait reason that we just don't understand. But infection is the second most common reason for an athlete to present to a team medic after injury, of course, which we've heard a bit about today. And it goes without saying that sickness correlates negatively with training volume. Viz, the less sick you are, the more you can train. It accounts for about a third of all lost training days and 2/3 of illness in one study with elite British athletes. 2/3 of illnesses result in time loss from training and a third result in performance restriction. More about that in just a second. We also know that heavy exercise can lead to clinical problems as well, beyond just a common cold, such as rhabdomyolysis, myopericarditis, and even increase the risk of exertional heat illness. Good study work in marathon runners, Two Oceans races in South Africa, in BJSM a few years ago now, 7,000 distance runners. They assessed upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, or URTI symptoms, as you'll hear from me today, including the neck check. Typically, we say to athletes, if you have symptoms below the neck, it's probably systemic, is the infection. And what you see in the two boxes at the bottom here is they asked them about these symptoms 8 to 12 days before the race. And they even provided some educational material to try and encourage the athletes, if they had below the neck symptoms, to stop training, etc. 1 in 5, so 20%, reported symptoms in the 8 to 12 days before the race. And even 1 in 13 failed the neck check, so likely systemic symptoms. But they mostly ignored the education and most still chose to race. But those who did choose to race, who had below the neck symptoms, were more than twice as likely to not finish the event. Not good news, of course. So what about this immune health thing, Neil? What affects immune health and why? Working around this kind of hub and spoke model, exercise immunologists like to think it's all about training stress. We recognize that life stress is also really, really important. And in fact, these things all interact. Well, why do they interact? Whether it's sleep, or poor sleep, environmental stress, travel and nutrition, the focus of today. Well, the way in which the body responds to challenges, or you could call these stresses if you like, is there's a coordinated set of responses via 2 effector limbs. One is the fight or flight effector limb, the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis. Allows us to quickly escape the jaws of a lion through evolution, if you like. And we know that nervous system innervates the immune system via the primary lymphoid tissue. We also end up with catecholamines such as adrenaline, and that also there are beta-adrenergic receptors on immune cells. Then there's the slower acting effector limb, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Much slower moving, results in the hormone cortisol, which we know to be anti-inflammatory. And for many years, we thought that increases in cortisol during prolonged exercise, like many of you will be doing on Sunday, would lower the immune system and suppress it. We even used terms like immune suppression back in the 90s. And this worried lots of athletes that they might be super susceptible to infection. But typically, if you look at the immune system of an athlete by collecting a blood sample on a rest day, so a good few hours since the last exercise session, an immunologist wouldn't raise an eyebrow. They have very normal immune systems. But it's very difficult to study this topic because there's so many interactions going on. For example, we showed in one study that surprised us a few years ago, levels of anxiety when a participant comes to the laboratory predicted how the immune system would respond to exercise that hadn't yet happened yet. So there's interactions going on here because, of course, the effector limbs I spoke to you about, it doesn't really matter whether this is sleep stress, exercise stress, you name it. That's how it affects the immune system via these axes. How does nutrition influence the immune system? Well, obviously, it's a fuel source for immune cells. They require fuel. The immune cells obviously require the building blocks because immune cells have offspring. They produce other cells. They also produce antibodies and cytokines and so on. Some of the nutrients are important substrates for the killing weaponry, which I'll talk a bit about. Some of them have direct antibacterial and antiviral effects. Zinc in zinc lozenges, I'll talk about later, has antiviral effects. Obviously, prebiotics, probiotics improve the diversity of the gut microbiome, which can also modulate the immune system. And number 7 is where I'll speak quite a bit about today, which is about those anti-inflammatory, tolerogenic type supplements that might dampen the immune system with beneficial effects for otherwise healthy individuals. I mentioned that a red hot topic is RED-S and low energy availability, and on that hub and spoke model in that BJSM paper on RED-S, immunity is one of those spokes. So low energy availability in athletes apparently suppresses the immune system. Well, here's one such study. It's always good to go back. Just at the end of the Second World War, Leighton's seminal work published in The Lancet, no less, he did a wonderful study looking at the effects of slow starvation in the German POW camps. And this is an elegant study because it's probably our first observation that prolonged, serious slow starvation can lower immune defense. There were 1,000 Russian prisoners of war, 250 British prisoners of war sharing living accommodation, performing up to 12 hours of hard labor each day. They were fed I'll call it a soup, a broth of that's horrible. It had gravel and stones and all sorts in it. Apparently, the stories are amazing. So they had this soup each day. It provided 1,600 calories, less than 50 grams of protein. Much of that was vegetable protein. And we know that protein is absolutely the key nutrient to maintain the immune system. Animal studies show that. Studies in protein energy malnutrition also show that protein is the key nutrient. The British prisoners were much luckier. They received the Red Cross supplement, which gave them an extra 1,300 calories a day, nearly 50 grams additional protein. And you can even see up here some of these protein sources are animal sources of protein as well. So after many days of this really restrictive diet, you can even see the pictures of these emaciated individuals. There were massive reductions in mood, increases in stress, poor sleep, and so on. But overall, Leighton observed health was pretty good, which was quite surprising. However, there was one exception that predated BCG vaccination for the BD-eyed here, which didn't come online until the NHS was formed, actually, in the 50s. The incidence of tuberculosis was far higher in the Russian troops who didn't, prisoners of war who didn't receive the Red Cross supplement. And Leighton noticed that tuberculosis onset and development and death were much more rapid in the malnourished Russian prisoners. We take about 80 years to catch up in sports science, and we are a bit slow on the uptake. Some work from the Australian Institute of Sport now in elite athletes over there. They had a group of 81 athletes in this case. They filled in the LEAF questionnaire, the low energy availability questionnaire. They only had 16 illnesses to predict here, but what they showed was that low energy availability in these athletes increased the risk of respiratory illness 7 times, or at least respiratory symptoms. This is quite exciting. It sort of supports that spoke on the red S model. But I'd like to provide you with 3 bits of evidence that I really think strongly support that it's not a problem, is low energy availability in otherwise healthy athletes, at least for the immune system. When you delve a bit deeper and you read a bit more broadly, you see that actually there's some striking paradoxes here. The anorexia nervosa patient is one such paradox. They actually report very few upper respiratory tracts infections, or URTI. There's really quite good evidence that they're quite well protected against URTI. And weirdly enough, they seem to suffer more URTIs upon refeeding. Quite strange, really. It doesn't sort of fit with what we'd expect. But the studies of immunity in these individuals show that, oh, my screen's just gone off. Oh, that's interesting. The blue screen of death. So anyway, luckily that blue screen's still on. Immunity's really well preserved in these individuals. Because protein is typically adequate, they tend to restrict carbohydrate and fat to these AN patients. Only when the body mass index falls well below 15 do you generally see lower cellular and humoral immunity. And cortisol, the bad guy, the anti-inflammatory hormone that dampens the immune system, only seems to go up in complete fasting. Second piece of evidence, even in protein and energy malnutrition, immunity is really well preserved until the very advanced stages. And cortisol, again, only increases during complete fasting. What about in athletes? Some work from Trent Stellingworth's group, got my T's and S's mixed up there. From his group, they used the LEAF questionnaire. They had some very high standard female endurance athletes, some of which weren't properly menstruating, they were amenorrheic. Their body mass index I've added there for comparison is 19, which is pretty low, but nothing like what you see in severe AN patients when their immune system just tend to tail off a little bit. When I look more closely at that work in most of those runners in Trent's study, you see that protein intake is more than adequate, over 2 grams per kilogram body mass per day in those individuals. And then the line there with the 25% energy restriction studies. We've done studies with the British military. Other studies in middle-aged adults show that a 20-25% energy restriction, even over a year, can have actually salubrious, so beneficial effects on health, on vaccination responses, skin immune tests, etc. And of course, we know from wonderful mainstream science, we've known this for decades now, that dietary restriction without malnutrition, which is key, no nutrient deficits, seems to be, really good for us. It extends our lifespan. Not a bad thing, right? When we look a bit more closely at the AIS's paper, there was the bit in red box that I didn't mention to you earlier on that they also found, which was the scores on depression questionnaires in those females who had low energy availability showed an 8 times increased risk of respiratory illness. So maybe psychiatric factors, stress, anxiety, depression are important predictors, as I showed you in my own hub and spoke earlier on. We know stress, depression has profound effects on the immune system. There's a whole group of brilliant scientists called psychoneuroimmunologists who've been telling us that for years. So what about this new paradigm that I presented that I'll talk about? Here's the old way that nutritional immunologists looked at the immune system. On the left, in the orange, you have the attack weaponry, the effector killers, if you like. On the right side of the scales, and this should balance for optimal immunity, so we used to think, you have the regulatory, the Treg cells, the cells that do the dampening, if you like. And that's how we used to think you reached optimal immunity. Obviously, we know when things go wrong and you have the effector side being too effective, if you like, a very strong killing weaponry in the orange here, and the scales tip, you have increased risk, of course, of autoimmune diseases, allergy and such like. And what we've learned mostly from invertebrate scientists, actually, they're the ones who've taught the human scientists, is that this has an excessive energy demand. When you have a big immune response, this is really wasteful and can take energy away from other vital processes. And the most elegant work on this that supports this was by Yannick Moray's group in 2000 in the journal Science, no less. They worked with bumblebees. Yeah, I think you're thinking this is a big tangent here, but they work with bumblebees. And what they did was they got a whole host of bumblebees. They starved some of them. And then they challenged all of the bumblebees to have a big immune response using lipopolysaccharide and latex beads. And they were shocked to see 70% of the starved bees died. And this demonstrates the huge impact of the energy requirements of a full-blown immune response. The best evidence for me. The other one is the collateral damage here when you have a full-blown immune response. There is tissue damage. And again, the best evidence is probably during COVID in the poor people who had, the cytokine storm when the immune system's going wild. And you have this acute respiratory distress syndrome, as many as the doctors in the room will be able to tell me much more about. So there are reasons why you don't want a big immune response in otherwise healthy individuals, at least. And the immune system has become evolved for what we'll use the term in a minute, tolerance. We used to think in exercise immunology, because plenty of studies in the 80s and 90s showed that after, say, a marathon, the immune system is temporarily lowered by, say, 20% for lymphocyte proliferation, antibody production, you name it. We showed that these things went down. But the following day, they were very normal. So we don't believe that athletes are clinically immune deficient anymore, but we kind of used to, I think it's fair to say. Another wonderful paper I return to quite a lot by Ayers and Schneider, again, invertebrate ecology folks, really. They say we need a better way of understanding how the immune system balances these things and actually to involve the microbe. They use an elegant metaphor of a castle for the immune system. The castle doesn't just go into attack mode always. It makes a decision as the inhabitants of the castle, just like the immune system. So the castle has to repair the walls with an attack, build some more walls potentially. It has offspring, just like the immune system has offspring in its new cells, and it shares resources as well. So a decision needs to be made about these two problems over here, energy demands and collateral damage. And that led me to draw this out quite simply in a sports med paper a few years ago, the main reading. I'll put this up at the end. Here on the left, we've got resistance, which I've spoken about a little bit. On the right, we've got this concept from ecology and invertebrate scientists, really, who've taught us this, about tolerance. So tolerance is keeping infection at a non-damaging level. Dampening the immune system now in otherwise healthy individuals is actually a good thing. And so whenever I see adverts for nutritional supplements that are immune boosting, it makes me shudder, and I tend to try and avoid those words immune and boosting to get together. There's really good evidence for this. One piece of evidence is, of course, if the immune system was hardwired to attack, the immune system would just obliterate all of the bacteria in our gut, the lipopolysaccharide and other bacteria that's there, the gut microbiome. But it doesn't. It works in tandem with the gut microbiome. Also, in the middle of the slide, there is something called co-stimulation that's been evolved down the thousands of years now, that actually, to have a full-blown immune response, you need two things. You need the microbial-associated molecular patterns, the MAMPs as we call them, and you need DAMPs, you need danger signals from damaged tissues. You need both to alert a full-blown response. There's plenty of other examples of this resistance and tolerance. Antimicrobial proteins in saliva and tears are really toxic to bugs, like viruses and bacteria, but they don't damage your own tissues. So now, when I looked back, we presented this model, I look back at the thousands of studies on supplements in well people and athletes and so on to support the immune system. Many of them could be termed resistant supplements that improve the killing weaponry. And when I looked back now with this new knowledge, it dawned on me why those supplements were never successful, those studies. The effects were not realized in athletes of giving supplements like carbohydrate, glutamine, oat beta-glucan, echinacea and so on. They just didn't work in athletes to apparently boost the immune system. For example, we know glutamine works well post-surgery in patients or really sick individuals or immunosuppressed people, but not in athletes who are not immunosuppressed. But then when I looked at other supplements that had more tolerogenic, these supplements dampen the immune system, they seem to do quite well in the studies, as I'll show you in a minute, like these ones here. Zinc, active zinc and zinc lozenges fit somewhere between the two, really. It improves resistance not by improving the immune system. It just stops the virus docking in the oral cavity, but it's also known as active zinc here for having anti-inflammatory or tolerogenic effects. Harry Hemmeler is well known as a proponent of zinc and vitamin C for treatment of the common cold. And what he's shown here, you can see the forest plots here, you want to be to the left of this zero line, is that on average, if an individual starts sucking upon zinc lozenges as soon as they've got a common cold, so within the first 24 hours of common cold, this is not a preventative day to day, it's just take the lozenges, allow them to dissolve in the mouth. There's a local effect of the active zinc, stopping the virus docking. And what you see is the colds are generally about a third shorter, about 33% shorter. And it doesn't matter whether the zinc lozenge is made up of acetate or gluconate, so he says. You need about 70 milligrams of active zinc a day in those studies. They generally show 75 milligrams is fine. It tends to work, and so there's that recommendation at the bottom. These are the targets, I think, and there'll be other tolerogenic targets as well that we need to look for. I'll speak briefly in a moment about probiotics, the mutualist symbionts that modulate the gut microbiome. Prebiotics as well are important here. Vitamin D, of course, the sunlight hormone. The sun goes away in the winter. We rely more on oral sources for our vitamin D. Vitamin C, we know they're obviously key antioxidant here, and there are good studies, only 5 or 6 though, in athletes. In fact, the key study that comes to mind was led by Edith Peters-Verteur in South Africa, and she sadly passed away just last week. She was the first to show that about 600 milligrams of vitamin C a day for 3 weeks before the Comrades race actually reduced respiratory symptoms in the weeks afterwards. So just quickly here, there's some good work on probiotics. This is a randomized controlled trial in elite runners, not many studies in our game in elite runners, that shows that actually probiotic supplementation can reduce the duration and tend to reduce the severity of infection. And actually it makes sense looking back at these studies now with a model of resistance and tolerance. I wouldn't expect so much that a tolerogenic supplement would reduce the incidence of infection. I would expect it to reduce how sick you get when you get sick, because obviously exposure is a big part of why people get sick. The challenge is the immune system's ability to mop this up and make you better again. Probiotics, there's some quite good work on probiotics being effective. Here is a meta-analysis, a Cochrane on probiotics. The unfortunate situation is there are very few studies, even in the general population, and so the quality is typically low. But they tend to have quite positive findings, these probiotic studies, at reducing the duration of common colds. Some recent work coming out now on COVID. Again, the quality of the work and the amount of work is quite poor. Only 3 studies in this meta-analysis on COVID, unfortunately. Vitamin D, a beautiful meta-analysis now with very high quality because there's plenty of studies and plenty of participants here. The IOM's recommendation is for 600 international units of vitamin D3 a day. What the nutshell of this study here, just the last couple minutes, the nutshell is that you see much better effects of vitamin D supplementation in studies of individuals who are deficient for vitamin D. So there's a need there. You see a massive reduction in the odds ratio, a 70% reduction in common cold incidence in people who really need vitamin D when you provide vitamin D. Vitamin D is anti-inflammatory, it dampens the immune system, so there's a really good rationale there. But again, Martineau's work from London here on COVID, there are some really quite positive studies on COVID, but they're often confounded as well because many of these studies showing, poorer outcomes in COVID patients with low vitamin D. These are associational studies. They're not causation studies. And so there are confounding issues there and biases that Martineau points out very well in this brand new paper. Just for the sake of time, I'll get to my final couple slides here. I was lucky enough to co-author a paper with Ron Morn here and Graham Close and Andy Casper on food first, which of course is important. Sophie mentioned that quite a bit today. But not food only, because we created some arguments for why there are cases where supplements should be considered. And number 5 is the one that I've been dealing with today. There are times actually with tolerance in mind, dampening an overly exuberant immune response, where actually it's a good idea to exceed the RNA for some, nutrients to dampen the burden of infection. Just leave you with this slide, and a QR to the review paper that accompanies it. Thank you very much for your time.
Do we have any questions for Professor Walsh?
Just asking for comment. Can you comment on the high incidence of asthma amongst marathon runners, and does it have any relevance to things you've been presenting?
It does very much so to the vitamin C findings that Edith Peters-Fature first presented. I know that Harry Hemmeler believes that the beneficial effects of high-dose vitamin C on respiratory symptoms after a marathon might be to some extent due to damage, exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, and vitamin C having a beneficial effect on that. So certainly for, I think, the vitamin C studies for sure, but I'm doubtful that that would have an effect on, the benefits, for example, of zinc lozenges for the treatment of common cold. One of the weaknesses of these studies is not all of them have pathological confirmed, RT-PCR, for example, to confirm that these are actually respiratory episodes that we're seeing, that are common colds. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions specifically for Professor Walsh? Okay, well, let's give Professor Walsh a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.